Can you hear? Ah, there we go. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. How lovely to see so many of you here, and how wonderful to be here. Sadly, too little of the choir. I would have loved to sit for 15 minutes or something, but thank you so much for singing. The tradition of choral music in the Northeast is extraordinary, as we all know, and it's always wonderful to be part of that and listen to it and immerse myself in it when I visit Nagaland. I'm actually following with a kind of religious work in a very different vein. Of course, in the 19th century, composers were still writing masses and so on, but other composers were thinking about the concert space and the concert hall, which is a different kind of space. And I'm going to start with some Liszt. Liszt, of course, had made himself famous as a concert artist all over Europe in the early part of the 19th century, from 1830 to about 1847. But in the latter part of his life, he stopped playing concerts entirely. He was bored with what he called the piano circus, going from city to city and showing off some piano playing. And he settled down mostly into a life of teaching, partly in Hungary, for creating the conservatoire in Hungary, and partly in Weimar, where all the great young pianists came for advice, and indeed some of the composers, including Brahms and Grieg, who came to see the elder statesman learn from him. But the other part of his life was religious. He took the first 4 orders towards becoming a priest in the Catholic Church, and for about 4 months a year, maybe 5, he would go to Rome and live the religious life and wear the cassock and have the tonsure. But he was too famous to live in Rome itself, because everybody knew him and mobbed him in the streets. And so he lived in this monastery, a little way outside Rome, called the Villa d'Este, the Villa of the East. And this piece was written there. You see, the villa or the monastery is on a hill, but the hill is a beautiful garden with old trees and, most importantly, fountains. Literally thousands of fountains. I've walked there, and you walk down a pathway and there are literally hundreds of jets of water. You turn the corner, there's a huge sculpture gushing water, and this was a very peaceful place for Liszt and for all people who go there. This piece, called Fountains of the Villa d'Este, is partly to give you the impression of Liszt strolling peacefully, calmly, beautifully through these amazing gardens. But it is also about baptism or rebaptism. In the bottom of the score, he quotes St. John's Gospel, and the moment where he says, "And the water I will give you will be an everlasting spring inside you." So this is both a piece of music about water and about fountains, and a piece of music about Christian renewal and the idea of being reborn. So this is Fountains at the Villa d'Este by Liszt. So now it gives me great pleasure to be joined by my colleague and indeed old friend, Nourhe Khate. I will just say I've known this guy for more than a decade now, which is surprising because he only looks about 14 anyway. But I'll tell you, so I first met him at my home in Goa, where he came for a week's masterclass when I was still a professor at Trinity College of Music, and we had a wonderful week together, spending the days practicing, playing, working, and then eating in the evenings, going to the beach at the end of the road, and being musicians together, creating communities. And I remind you, as musicians, and indeed as a broad school, the most important things you will do as musicians is create communities and take the whole of the world forward with you in your music and in your beliefs. We're going to play, so obviously the last piece was kind of autobiographical of Liszt, but it was also religious. This one, very different, is this theme from Schindler's List, the film about essentially the Holocaust and Schindler, who attempted and did amazingly in saving many of the people from the camps. And there's this beautiful violin solo, which is partly based, of course, on Jewish music, and partly, of course, it is film music. And it tries to tell the tale of both the sadness and elements of hope, I guess, because no matter how terrible the situation, there is always hope, particularly, I suspect, through the arts and through music. So we will just play you the theme from Schindler's List, of course. Lena, could you grab my score for me? Thank you. Just bring the whole thing, Lena, please. Thank you so much, Nourhe. We will, of course, see Nourhe again later at the end of the concert. So I'm going to go to Beethoven next. Of course, Beethoven was one of the most important of the piano composers, indeed of any composer. And in the early part of his life, he needed to conquer Vienna and be the most important composer in Vienna, which he did by maybe 1800. The next thing he needed to do was kind of conquer the world. And by 1810 or 1815, the Third Symphony, the Fifth Symphony, the Appassionata Sonata, the Waldstein, all these extraordinary, powerful, energetic, dynamic works were known throughout Europe. And even in London, people were commissioning works from Beethoven, most famously, of course, the Ninth Symphony. That's how famous, maybe possibly the most famous musician up until that point, known across Europe, because it was possible to be that through publishing and travel and so on. Then the last part of Beethoven's life, he looked to try to see if music could bring people together. And for him, that meant particularly, not necessarily nations, though that was involved, but class systems. He felt that there was no difference between the aristocrat and the farmer and the middle class, and he wanted some sense that music was for everybody rather than just the wealthy. And so in his music, he started to incorporate folk elements, music of the people, music of the peasants and the farmers and so on. And I'm going to play you a very late piece of Beethoven's towards the end of his life. It's just, he calls it a bagatelle, it's a throwaway piece of piano music, though of course it is not a throwaway piece, it's a very important piece. And you will hear, it's a kind of folk dance, and often you will hear things like this in the bass. That's a kind of folk drone that you would find in Viennese folk music at the time. That's one aspect of this. So he's trying to say this folk music is the world's music and it belongs in the concert hall, not just outside in the fields. But the second thing is that this, as far as we can tell, is slightly autobiographical. At some points you will hear what sounds like a bit like a flute. Etc. And we think that this is a memory of a time when he was at a little village outside Vienna on a day trip with a friend, and his friend pointed out the shepherd playing a flute. And Beethoven suddenly realized that although he could see the shepherd playing the flute, he could not hear the shepherd playing the flute because he was now profoundly deaf. For a musician, of course, particularly at this time, that was an extraordinary, terrible, terrible thing. And it seems to us that there's a passage which has this flute and has this bass line, which is folk-like, and there's a sudden silence. And this seems to us to be Beethoven recalling that terrible moment in his autobiography at the same time as trying to bring the world together. So this is a bagatelle from Opus 126 from the 1820s, very close to the end of Beethoven's life. Next, I'm going to play some Grieg. But it is well to remember at this point, no less with Beethoven than as with Grieg, that in the 19th century and the 20th century, Western classical music largely depended on the economics of making music. Beethoven needed to make music that was popular because he was no longer being paid in the sense that Mozart or Haydn was by a royal prince or by the church. He was a freelance musician making it on his own, though he did have some help, of course, from some nobles. Likewise, Grieg. Grieg is there as a musician, but if he doesn't write music that is attractive, popular, interesting, he doesn't eat. So some of the most extraordinary music of the 19th century was, as it happens, written by Grieg. And he wrote this large series of piano pieces. He called them lyric pieces. It doesn't matter what they're called particularly. But what was interesting is they were so popular that it was said that there was not one piano across Europe that did not at that time have a copy of Grieg on the side or in the stool. That's how important it was. And literally, he would turn up at his publishers, Peter's publishers in Leipzig, with some new pieces. And when he arrived, and he gave them to them to publish, they literally used to raise a flag because they knew that for the next 2 years, they were going to be solvent and have enough money to keep publishing things. That's how important this relationship at that time, and even today, maybe even more today, the relationship between the composer, the performer, and the public in terms of economics. Curious and interesting. So, I'm going to play what we again think is a very autobiographical work by Grieg. He just calls it a nocturne, a night piece, something about the night, dreamy perhaps. But in the middle, you will hear this. And that is the piano imitation of a nightingale. Now, in romantic music, and particularly romantic literature, poetry, romantic songs, the nightingale is always a reference to first love and to things like that. And so, what we think is probably this is Grieg remembering very warmly his first meeting with his then future and later wife. So this is both autobiographical, but he doesn't necessarily want you to know, so he just calls it nocturne. But the fact that we have the nightingale halfway through tells us that this is about probably that first meeting. So this is as much a love song as it is a nocturne. So for the final of my solo pieces, before I invite Nourhe back, I'm going back to the idea of water, but this time a bit later. Liszt probably wrote the first water piece, the one you heard at the beginning of this concert, for piano. But Ravel was someone who was very interested and influenced by Liszt's playing, his compositions, and his pianism. And Ravel wrote a couple of water pieces, and I'm going to play one of them. This is the tale of Ondine, the water sprite. And the story goes that there's a man on the balcony or the turret of a castle, and he hears a harmony, a strange murmuring in the distance. And gradually it becomes apparent that in the moat around the castle there is a water nymph singing to him. This is a kind of siren song, it's a seductive song, and she sings very sweetly to him, saying, "Come, come, be my husband. Come into the water. Come and be king of the water and the palace and the lakes." And increasingly, she tries to drag him down more passionately, more seductively, and each time he seems to refuse. And finally, he just says, "Stop. I'm actually in love with a mortal woman who is in the castle." Done. And she sheds a single tear. She bursts into laughter and then disappears into a shower of foam that runs down the window panes of the castle. Extraordinary imagery, Gothic fantasy, Gothic horror, and so on. And Ravel, being a 20th century composer, this is from 1909, said, well, I'm really trying to create a parody of this Gothic surprise horror poem. After he'd finished composing, he put his hands up and said, really, I have failed. What I've actually done is produced a romantic piece itself instead of a parody of a romantic piece, which is kind of quite odd. What is particularly interesting, I hope, to you as an audience, you will hear this melody wandering around, getting inside our heads. But all the time, Ravel is changing the quality of the water. It's like it's always shifting and simmering in front of you. Sometimes bright, sometimes dark, light, shade, all of these qualities he tries to give you in the piano accompaniments. But then occasionally, from the bass, you'll hear something dark, because we know that this sprite is evil in some way, trying to drag this man down. So both of these stories are continually being told in this piece, all at the piano. So this is, you might say, a tall tale. So finally we come to a piece by the, well, actually there's a bit of a story. I'm not going to tell you who it's by to start with. The very one of the, maybe the top 3 violinists of the 20th century was a man by the name of Fritz Kreisler. Extraordinary musician, often played with Rachmaninoff, the pianist, and recorded together and so on. And Kreisler went around playing all sorts of concerts, and occasionally he would come out and say, I have discovered this early manuscript by one of the early Italian 18th century composers, or sometimes 17th century composers. You say, I found this piece and I'm going to play it to you, and we've just added a piano part and so on. And people are going, this is amazing. He keeps finding these manuscripts here, there, and everywhere of these ancient pieces of music. And they were always fabulous violin pieces, very virtuosic, with some piano accompaniment. After he died, it turned out that he'd written all these pieces himself, and that they'd never existed as early pieces. He had just written these pieces in the style of, as pastiche pieces, to show off his violin technique. And just said, oh, yeah, it's by this person, this person. So now we say the piece is by Kreisler, inspired by whichever composer he said it was by. But what an extraordinary bit of life story, that there is the most famous violinist in the world, but he doesn't want to be judged as a composer, so he pretends someone else has composed it, tells everybody that it's by someone else, and goes around the world playing these pieces. As you can imagine, of course, it's a very complex and difficult violin part. It's not such a complex, difficult piano part, thank goodness. So we're going to play the Prelude and Allegro. Which is the composer he said it was by? I can't remember either. Does it say? Ah, yes. He said it was by Pugnani, who was a composer writing in the late 18th century, sort of Haydn's time. But actually it sounds nothing like anything from that time, because it's far more complex and far more virtuosic. So what a great piece. So before we go, thank you very much. It's lovely to see quite so many of you. This is a huge hall, and so a big hi to the people at the back. Thank you all for coming. I hope you've had a good evening, and it's always a pleasure for me to be in Nagaland, to be in Dimapur, Kohima. So thank you for coming, and very big congratulations to all the pianists who came this afternoon. Some of them played, some of them listening, all of them asking interesting questions. It is always through our community and through relationships of this kind that we all grow as musicians. So it is always a pleasure to be here, and as I say, it's always a pleasure to be with this man. This time, instead of behind the desk auditioning him, actually as his colleague.